In the year 476, a teenage boy named Romulus Augustulus was quietly removed from his throne by a barbarian general named Odoacer. He was the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire. There was no great final battle. No apocalyptic siege. The boy was simply sent away to a country villa with a pension. The most powerful state the world had ever known did not explode. It simply flickered, and went out, almost without anyone noticing the exact moment it died. For the next 1,000 years, much of Europe would slide into a fractured, dangerous, and often forgotten age. Knowledge was lost. Cities crumbled. Whole technologies vanished from human memory. And yet roads built by Roman hands remained the finest in Europe for over 1,000 years after the empire that built them was gone. History is balanced on a knife edge. So let us ask one of the greatest questions in all of history. What if Rome had never fallen? What if that light had never gone out? To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what Rome actually was. And its scale is almost impossible to imagine today. At its height, the Roman Empire stretched from the rain-soaked hills of Scotland to the burning deserts of Arabia, from the cold Atlantic coast to the warm rivers of the Middle East. It governed perhaps a quarter of every human being alive on the entire planet. A single state, a single law, a single network of roads stretching more than 50,000 miles. Those roads were so well engineered, paved and drained and laid dead straight across mountains and marshes, that some of them are still walked and driven on 2,000 years later. Romans had running water. Public baths the size of cathedrals. Sewers, heated floors, and apartment blocks 6 stories high in cities lit by oil lamps. They poured a concrete so durable that we are only now, with modern chemistry, beginning to understand why their harbors and domes have survived 2,000 years in the sea and the rain. Their engineers raised aqueducts that carried fresh water across entire valleys, on stone arches so precise that many still stand today, and a handful still carry water to fountains in living cities. In the heart of the capital stood the Colosseum, an arena of stone that could seat 50,000 roaring spectators, with hidden lifts and trapdoors beneath a wooden floor covered in sand. And the Pantheon, crowned with a dome of unreinforced concrete that would remain the largest of its kind anywhere on Earth for more than 13 centuries. To feed the million people of the capital, a vast fleet of grain ships sailed constantly from Egypt and North Africa, an ancient supply chain feeding a city larger than any in Europe for the next 1,500 years. It was a city with traffic laws, fire brigades, and a police force. Its wealthy homes had underfloor heating, and over the Colosseum, sailors worked a vast retractable awning to shade 50,000 spectators from the midday sun. No city in Europe would grow as large as ancient Rome again until London, more than 1,500 years later. Just stop and let that sink in for a moment. Its armies were a professional machine of stunning discipline. The legions did not just fight. They built the roads, the bridges, the forts, and the walls that held a third of the known world together. Roman law was so carefully built that it still forms the foundation of the legal systems of dozens of nations today. Ideas like a contract, a will, or being innocent until proven guilty, all flow from Rome. Their doctors, building on Greek learning, performed surgery, set bones, and treated wounded soldiers in dedicated military hospitals. The writings of the physician Galen would go on to guide European medicine for over 1,000 years. Roman trade reached far beyond its borders. Merchants carried silk from China and spices and gemstones from India, and Roman coins have been dug up by archaeologists as far away as the coast of Vietnam. A traveler could journey from Britain to Egypt using a single currency, speaking a single language, protected by a single army, sleeping in way stations spaced along the road. This was not just an empire. It was a machine for civilization, running at a scale the world would not see again for well over 1,000 years. So how does something this vast, this advanced, simply die? The truth is, Rome did not fall in a single moment. It bled out slowly, over centuries. The empire had grown too big to defend. Its borders ran for thousands of miles, pressed on every side by migrating peoples who were themselves fleeing wars and famines far to the east. The economy strained under the crushing cost of its endless armies. The silver coinage was quietly debased again and again, inflation tore through the markets, and taxes ground down the very citizens the empire was meant to protect. In the 3rd century, the empire nearly collapsed entirely, in 50 years of chaos with more than 20 emperors, most of them murdered. It was pulled back from the brink, but only by becoming a harder, more military, more desperate state. A soldier emperor named Diocletian dragged it back from the edge with ruthless reforms, reorganizing the army, the coinage, and the government. But to do it, he doubled the bureaucracy, deepened the burden on the people, and formally split the rule of the empire between several men. Then the Emperor Constantine made 2 decisions that would echo for 1,000 years. He embraced the new religion of Christianity, and he founded a dazzling new capital in the east, Constantinople, shifting the empire's center of gravity away from the city of Rome forever. Then, in a fateful decision, the empire was split in 2, a western half and an eastern half, to make it easier to rule. But the west grew poorer and weaker, while the wealthy east kept the trade, the cities, and the gold. Far to the east, a storm was gathering. The Huns, fearsome horsemen from the steppes of Asia, came smashing westward, driving entire nations of Goths and Vandals before them, straight onto Rome's frontiers. In 378, a Roman army was annihilated by Gothic warriors at the Battle of Adrianople, and an emperor was killed on the field. The legions were no longer invincible, and everyone knew it. In 410, the unthinkable happened. The city of Rome itself, which had not seen a foreign enemy in 800 years, was sacked by the Visigoths. The shock rippled across the entire ancient world. A few decades later came Attila the Hun, the so-called Scourge of God, carving a path of terror across Europe. And in 455, Rome was brutally sacked a second time, now by the Vandals. Plague swept through the crowded cities. Civil wars tore at the leadership. Whole provinces slipped quietly out of imperial control, defended by no one, paying taxes to no one. So when Odoacer finally pushed that boy emperor off the throne, it was less an explosion than an exhaustion. The Western Empire did not so much get conquered as simply stop functioning, province by province, year by year. And the consequences were staggering. Without the empire to hold it together, the West shattered into hundreds of small, warring kingdoms, each one a splinter of the shattered whole. The great cities emptied. Rome itself, once home to 1 million people, shrank to a town of a few thousand, with sheep grazing in the forum among the ruins of its own lost glory. Trade routes collapsed. Coins stopped circulating. Literacy nearly vanished outside the thick stone walls of monasteries, where a handful of monks copied ancient books by candlelight. The knowledge of how to mix Roman concrete, how to raise an aqueduct, how to run a city of 1 million people, was simply forgotten, in some cases for over 1,000 years. For centuries, people lived among Roman ruins they could no longer build, or even understand, like children playing in the bones of a giant. This is the world we have come to call the Dark Ages. But before we imagine saving Rome, there is a stunning fact that most people forget. Because in truth, half of the Roman Empire never fell at all. While the West crumbled, the richer eastern half simply carried on. From its magnificent capital at Constantinople, it called itself Roman for another 1,000 years. We now know it as the Byzantine Empire. And this is the part that should make us pause. Byzantium suffered no dark age. It kept its cities, its libraries, its Roman law, and the unbroken knowledge of the ancient world. It preserved the works of the Greek philosophers, the engineers, and the scientists. It had wealth, stability, and 1,000 extra years of civilization that the West had lost. And yet, here is the crucial point. Byzantium did not industrialize. It did not have a scientific revolution. It did not leap to steam engines or factories or flight. A surviving piece of Rome, with all its knowledge intact, simply continued for 1,000 years as a glorious, conservative, deeply traditional state, until it too finally fell to invaders in 1453. Hold that thought, because it is the key that will unlock our entire question. For now, let us do what historians and dreamers have always done, and change a single thread in the tapestry of history. Let us imagine that the Western Empire, too, found a way to survive. It does not require a miracle. Perhaps the 3rd century reforms hold, and the economy never breaks. Perhaps the empire is never split in two. Perhaps a great general turns back the Huns for good, or a stable line of emperors ends the endless, bloody civil wars before they bleed the West dry. It takes only a few better decisions, at a few critical moments. And in this version of history, the great machine of Rome does not break down. It keeps running, in the West as well as the East. The first and most profound change is this. There are no dark ages in the West either. That 1,000-year gap in European progress simply never happens at all. The knowledge is never lost, because the libraries are never abandoned. The engineering never disappears, because the engineers never stop working. Every generation builds on the last, without a single break. And think about what the Romans had already inherited. From the Greeks, they had geometry, astronomy, advanced medicine, and the first true beginnings of physics and mechanical engineering. A Greek inventor named Hero of Alexandria had even built a working steam engine, a hollow ball that spun on jets of boiling steam. He also built coin-operated machines and automatic doors. To the Romans, these were clever toys. But in a world that keeps advancing, a toy is just an idea waiting for its moment. Now imagine that idea developed not over 1,000 years, but over 200. A Roman steam engine, pumping water out of deep mines, turning the great wheels of mills, and one day, perhaps, driving a ship against the wind or a wagon along an iron track. The Industrial Revolution that arrived in our world around the year 1800 might instead have come 1,000 years earlier, in a society that already had the roads, the cities, and the organization to use it. Picture steam-powered workshops in the 2nd century. Roman factories. Iron railways running dead straight along those famous Roman roads, carrying goods and soldiers across 3 continents in days instead of months. And all of it under one single banner. In our history, Europe fractured into dozens of rival nations, each with its own language, its own jealous borders, and its own endless wars. But in a surviving Rome, those borders never form. From the Atlantic to the Persian frontier, there is one citizenship, one body of law, and one language that everyone, everywhere, can read and speak. There is no French, no Spanish, no Italian, no English as we know them. They are all just dialects of Latin, the way they very nearly became in reality anyway. And remember, this almost happened. The Latin that ordinary Romans spoke never truly died. It slowly broke apart into French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Romanian. Even English is, by some counts, more than half Latin, borrowed in through French. You, watching this right now, might well be thinking in Latin. A single, unified, advancing super-state spanning 3 continents, perhaps 1,000 years ahead of schedule. Follow this thread further, and it becomes almost dizzying. If the Industrial Revolution arrives 1,000 years early, then what about everything that came after it? The leap from the first steam engine to the first powered airplane took humanity about 150 years. The leap from that first airplane to the first human being on the moon took only 66. Run that same breathtaking acceleration inside a Rome that industrialized in the 2nd century, and you reach a strange, almost unbelievable conclusion. Romans might have walked on the moon not in the 20th century, but somewhere around the year 700, while most of our real ancestors were still farming the land by hand with wooden tools. Imagine the eagle standard of the legions, planted not on some distant earthly battlefield, but in the gray, silent dust of another world entirely. It is a breathtaking picture. A united, peaceful, hyper-advanced humanity, centuries ahead of where we actually stand today. But before we get carried away, we have to ask a much harder question. Would it really have happened that way? Because there is a powerful argument that says the exact opposite is true. And remember Byzantium, the surviving half of Rome that kept all its knowledge, and still never made the leap. Here is the uncomfortable idea. Rome was built on slavery. An enormous part of its economy ran on the forced labor of millions of enslaved human beings. And when you have a seemingly limitless supply of human muscle to do all your work, you have very little reason to invent an expensive machine to do it for you. Hero's steam engine stayed a toy precisely because Rome did not need it. Why build a costly machine when a slave costs almost nothing? Necessity is the mother of invention, and Rome felt very little necessity. And there is a second, deeper problem. Empires with no rivals tend to grow comfortable. They stop taking risks. They stop questioning themselves. They begin to worship their own past instead of building a future. A single, all-powerful state can enforce one single way of thinking across an entire continent, for centuries on end, and quietly crush any new idea it happens to dislike. Now compare that to what actually happened after Rome fell. Europe shattered into dozens of competing kingdoms, all crammed together on one small continent, all desperate to outdo one another. And that competition, savage as it so often was, became an engine. If one kingdom banned a dangerous new idea, an inventor could simply cross a border and find a rival ruler eager to fund it. In a single, unified Rome, there would have been nowhere to run. One ban, one censor, one suspicious emperor, could have smothered a world-changing idea everywhere at once, forever. And history hands us a haunting real example of exactly this. China, for most of its history, was almost precisely what a surviving Rome would have been. A vast, unified, sophisticated empire, often centuries ahead of Europe in science and technology. The Chinese invented gunpowder, the compass, paper, and printing, long before Europe did. And yet the Industrial Revolution did not ignite in unified, orderly China. It ignited in tiny, divided, quarrelsome Europe. That parallel is almost impossible to ignore. It was this messy, divided, endlessly competitive Europe, and not a single empire, that eventually produced the printing press, the scientific method, the great voyages of discovery, and at long last the Industrial Revolution. And consider one more strange twist. Much of the lost Greek and Roman knowledge survived not in Europe at all, but in the libraries of the Islamic world, before flowing back into Europe centuries later to help spark the Renaissance. So the great irony is this. The very fragmentation that the fall of Rome unleashed, the thing that looks at first like a pure catastrophe, may have been the exact pressure that forced the modern world into being. A surviving Rome might not have given us spaceships in the year 700. Like Byzantium, it might instead have given us 1,000 years of comfortable, stable, magnificent stagnation. The honest truth is that nobody can ever truly know. And that is exactly what makes this question so endlessly, hauntingly fascinating. Because Rome is the great hinge of Western history. Its rise gave us our laws, our languages, our roads, our calendar, our architecture, and the very layout of our cities. And its fall cleared the ground from which our entire modern world would eventually grow. We are, all of us, still living in the long, slow aftermath of that one collapse. Every map of Europe. Every Romance language. Every domed cathedral, every straight old road, every row of columns on every grand government building, is an echo of Rome. Picture for a moment a world with a single global culture descended directly from Rome. One calendar, one alphabet, one shared family of gods and heroes, stretching unbroken from the ancient world all the way to the age of spaceflight. The boy emperor, quietly pushed off his throne in 476, never knew that he was standing at one of the single greatest turning points in the entire human story. Maybe a surviving Rome would have carried us to the stars 1,000 years early. Or maybe its fall was the necessary fire that forged everything we have become. Perhaps, strangely, both of those things are true at once. What we can say for certain is this. The world you live in was shaped just as deeply by the death of Rome as it ever was by its life. And somewhere inside that ancient, slow collapse lies the one question that will never stop haunting us, the question that sits at the very heart of all history. What if?